Thank you very much. So we have good news. We've reached a deal. It's a good deal for everybody, I believe. And I think you were saying this is probably the biggest deal ever reached in any capacity, trade or beyond trade.
It is.
It's a giant deal with lots of countries.
We have a deal. We have a trade deal between the two largest economies in the world. And it's a big deal, it's a huge deal. It will bring stability, it will bring predictability. That's very important for our businesses on both sides of the Atlantic. It's 15% tariffs across the board, all inclusive.
After months of intense negotiations, the US and the EU have reached a 15% tariff agreement on EU goods, averting a full-scale trade war. While sectors like wine, cheese, and olive oil can breathe a sigh of relief, escaping the top 30% tariff, many European businesses remain concerned about competition and market pressures. So who truly benefits from this deal? Greece is currently the fifth largest olive oil exporter to the U.S. market, with volumes ranging from 8,000 to 10,000 tons annually. The olive oil industry is a vital part of the Greek economy, employing tens of thousands of workers, with over 750 production facilities, many of which are family-run, involved from cultivation to production. An official from the Greek olive oil industry stated that the 15% import tariff imposed by the United States on goods from the European Union is an acceptable compromise compared to the initial plan to levy tariffs up to 30%, which would have been considered severely damaging to the country's export sector.
It could have been worse. In other words, from the 30% that we could have had, which would have been bad, 15% is better. It is something that I believe businesses, can handle based on the current facts at the moment concerning exporting companies in Greece.
Metrokos believes that at current price levels, companies can absorb the increased costs from the 15% tariff, but if it were 30%, the industry would face severe difficulties. What worries him more is the possibility that competitors from other countries might negotiate lower tariffs, making competition for Greek businesses even fiercer.
We think this 15% can be absorbed by the companies. We believe it is a percentage that will not affect them. But further to that, what is very important is what will happen with tariffs on competitive countries, such as Turkey and Tunisia, which have increased their exports to the United States. And if tariffs on them are imposed and they are lower, that will certainly harm Greek olive oil. We must always wait to see how Mr. Trump will wake up and what he will decide to do. Anyway, the United States is a country that determines the global market, so I think we need to learn to live like this. And Greece does not make decisions alone. It is a member of the European Union, so export policy, and not only, is managed by the EU. Greece does not make decisions alone.
According to the European Commission, the EU is currently the world's leading producer and exporter of olive oil, accounting for approximately 67% of global production and 65% of total global olive oil exports. The United States, Brazil, and Japan are the three main consumer markets for this product. Although this latest US-EU trade agreement has helped prevent the worst-case scenario, the Greek olive oil industry in particular, and the EU's olive oil sector in general, are still facing new challenges as they enter a more intense competitive phase in the international market. Following the announcement by European leaders of a framework trade agreement with the United States on July 27, 2025, which will impose a 15% import tariff on most goods from the EU, European wine producers might be among the few beneficiaries of this deal. This is because it's expected to include tariff exemptions for some agricultural products, and, according to trade and industry officials, alcoholic beverages could be on that exempted list. However, many wine producers still express concerns about the impact of macroeconomic issues, including widespread tariff increases on the wine industry.
My main focus is the wine business overall, but I'm very worried about the economy overall. And we all know wine consumption doesn't thrive very well when we have seen economic crisis in the past. So this could be a domino effect that could hit the wine trade also. I think it's better than 30%, but like I said, 15% on top of another 14/15% on the dollar exchange rate makes 30. And this is already pretty bad. So if you ask me, I'm not very happy with 15% either, Among the three products we export to United States, which is Valpolicella, Ripasso, and Amarone, I think Amarone is the less sensitive because it's already a premium wines with a pretty high price already. So I don't think it will be a dramatic change. I'm more worried about Valpolicella and Ripasso, which are mainstream, and a price increase could possibly damage the sales. And then we all know, in history, stability and free trade has always been the key for healthy business. And this is my start, a tariff war spread around Europe and the US and possibly other countries. So definitely not good news.
We believe that, given that 70% of Valpolicella wines are exported worldwide, the fewer restrictions there are, the better. But I think this applies to everyone. The consortium is always committed to guarantee the quality of its wines to consumers, and we also try to protect the image of Valpolicella wines.
The president of France's National Federation of Cheese Producers stated that manufacturers felt relieved by the news of the trade agreement between the European Union and the United States, but simultaneously noted that it remains an unsatisfactory deal. Although the agreement is better than the 30% tariff that Trump once threatened and provides more clarity for European automobile, aircraft, and chemical manufacturers, the basic 15% import tariff is still much higher than the initial expectation of a zero tariff agreement. It is also higher than the average U.S. import tariff last year, which was only around 2.5%.
It's quite the relief. It's a deal that is, for us, necessary, because between 15% and 30%, we thought it was better to take the 15%. And this also provides visibility to businesses, which is also important. There's nothing worse for an economic actor, a business, or whatever economic leader, than not knowing what tomorrow will look like and how one will be able to organize their markets, their investments, as well as the trade conditions in which they can grow. And so at least this deal has the merits of allowing for clarification of things and not leaving economic actors in uncertainty. Now, I'm tempted to say that this deal is a lesser evil, going as far as saying, as Ursula von der Leyen said, that this is a good deal. I maybe won't go that far, because I think this remains a deal that remains unfavorable for Europeans, for European businesses. The announced 15% tariffs, all else considered, is still more significant than the 10% currently in place for the majority of dairy products. So adding 5% to the current 10% could lead to losses. Currently, within the 350 million euros, which is approximately $407 million in yearly earnings through export of French dairy and cheese products to the United States, if we're at 15% instead of 10%, we will of course have several millions of euros in losses in dairy products, especially in cheeses, and most notably low-end and moderately priced, which are more sensitive to these price changes.
Mr. Huard stated that under the new agreement framework, premium French cheeses with protected geographical indications will be somewhat cushioned from tariff impacts, something that would not have been possible if the 30% rate had been applied. However, the 15% tariff will place significant pressure on mainstream and mid-range cheeses sold in supermarkets, which could lead to millions of euros in losses, he added. France currently exports approximately 350 million euros worth of dairy products, primarily cheeses, to the United States annually.
If we went up to 30% tariffs, I would say that all types of cheeses would have been affected. Even when you're an American with sufficient earnings to pay for a nice cheese with protected appellation, at that point, you will think twice if you have an increase of 30% on prices. I think that the fact that the European Commission had approved 2 packages of measures that regroup impacts on around 100 billion euros, 116.4 billion approx, of American products at least allowed us to limit the effects from 30% to 15%. It didn't fully achieve to dissuade the American authorities, but it at least allowed to diminish a bit the crisis and the trade war, and to bring everyone back to reason and around the table. Voila.
The trade agreement between the US and the EU is considered to bring relative relief to European industries by avoiding the worst-case scenario of a 30% tariff. It provides a certain degree of clarity and stability for businesses, which they greatly need for planning. However, stakeholders universally agree that this is not an ideal agreement. The 15% tariff remains a considerable burden compared to the 0% or lower rates they had hoped for, especially when compared to competitors from other countries. Mainstream and lower-value product sectors will face the greatest pressure, while premium products may be less affected.
We know when we talk about EU-US trade relations, so there are some countries which are particularly exposed, like Germany, Italy, but also Ireland. Now, somehow this agreement is a relief because, for instance, on car, now the tariffs will be lower than what was in place until yesterday. And pharma are part of the trade agreement, of the trade deal, we should say. And there was a risk of much higher tariffs. So in this sense, there may be some sense of relief for these countries. Now, the reality is that tariffs will kick in and they will imply higher prices for US consumers buying EU goods.
The framework trade agreement between the US and the EU, while averting the worst-case scenario, still paints a mixed picture of both relief and concern for European export sectors. The 15% tariff is seen as a temporary reprieve, but remains a significant financial burden, especially as competitors may benefit from more preferential tariff rates. Experts and industry leaders alike agree that this agreement falls short of the EU's initial desire for full free trade and poses new challenges to competitiveness. As a consequence, American consumers might face higher prices for European goods, while EU businesses may need to reevaluate their market and investment strategies. Despite positive signs of easing trade tensions, the anxieties voiced by European businesses and manufacturers indicate that the road ahead for transatlantic trade relations remains full of challenges and uncertainties, particularly as both sides await specific details of the agreement and potential shifts in future U.S. trade policy.